The tension in the air was palpable. The hum of the airplane's engines provided a background to the uneasy atmosphere that hung over the flight attendants and pilot. This wasn't a routine flight. It wasn't a routine day. The rich black billionaire sitting in first class had a reputation for arrogance that preceded him, and today, that arrogance would cross the line. It started with a small comment. The billionaire, draped in designer clothes, smirked as he barked orders at the flight attendants. He demanded things that weren't on the menu, mocked the professionalism of the crew, and made his discomfort known to everyone in earshot. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the cabin with an air of superiority, his voice dripping with condescension every time he spoke. The flight attendants had heard it before, rich passengers who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. His insults were personal. The flight attendant, a woman of strength and quiet grace, had always prided herself on keeping composure. She was used to difficult passengers, but this man pushed every boundary. His words weren't just about entitlement, they were about stripping her of her dignity. He questioned her abilities, criticized her mannerisms, and laughed at her. All of it calculated, designed to make her feel small, insignificant. It wasn't just an annoyance, it was an attack. She tried to ignore it at first, focusing on her duties, keeping the cabin in order, and pretending the words didn't affect her. But they did. Every patronizing comment, every dismissive gesture, stung harder than she anticipated. She looked to the pilot for support, but he was no different, his eyes glazed over with a hint of unease. He had dealt with the same man earlier in the flight. His rude, demanding nature had already worn thin on him. The tension between the billionaire and the crew was now undeniable. It wasn't just a small confrontation anymore. This man, sitting comfortably in his chair with a glass of champagne, was pushing the limits. His final words to the flight attendant broke her resolve. "You think you're good at your job? You don't even know what real service is. You're just here to serve me." The slap came instinctively, a release of pent-up frustration and indignation. Her hand connected with his face, a sharp sound echoing in the otherwise quiet cabin. The billionaire's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, everything stopped. The cabin fell into silence, the air thick with disbelief. The pilot, who had been silently observing from the front of the cabin, knew it was time to step in. He had watched enough. His sense of professionalism, his own pride, was on the line. He stepped forward, grabbing the billionaire's wrist and pulling him forward, as if to steady the situation. But there was no steadiness left. The slap was now a symbol of resistance. The power dynamic had shifted. The billionaire didn't move. He didn't shout or lunge at them. Instead, a small, calculated smile crept across his lips. He looked from the flight attendant to the pilot, then to the rest of the passengers who were now watching the scene unfold. His gaze lingered on the flight attendant for a long, drawn-out moment. "Do you think this is over?" he said, his voice calm, almost eerily so. "You'll regret this." His words were ice, chilling the air between them. He didn't flinch from the slap. He didn't express anger, just an eerie calmness, as if he had already anticipated this reaction. His face, slightly reddened from the contact, held no sign of fury. In fact, it was a mask, a controlled expression of something far deeper than mere anger. The billionaire wasn't shaken. He was calculating. The flight attendant's heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts raced. It was clear now that he wasn't like the usual passengers. He wasn't going to storm off the plane or demand a refund. No. This man would retaliate, mentally, not physically. As she returned to her duties, trying to compose herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The slap had been a moment of release, but it had also opened a door to something darker. Something far more dangerous. She had crossed a line, but so had he. And now, the real battle would begin. It wouldn't be fought with slaps or shouts. It would be a battle of wits, a war of nerves. He wasn't just going to let this go. He would find a way to break her down, to make her feel the weight of her actions in ways that no physical retaliation ever could. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. The billionaire, ever so composed, leaned back in his seat, as if waiting for the inevitable. His eyes flicked to the flight attendants, and then to the pilot, every once in a while offering a knowing smile. The tension in the cabin was thick, but it was a different kind of tension now. The slap had ignited something that couldn't be erased. And the flight crew would soon realize that they had unwittingly walked into a game they were ill-prepared for. The billionaire's eyes gleamed with a mixture of anger and amusement, but it wasn't the anger they had seen earlier. This was something calculated. He wasn't reacting emotionally, he was plotting. Every moment, every interaction, every word from here on would be part of his plan to regain control. The flight attendant could feel it. The pilot could feel it. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew the game had only just begun. The billionaire's response to the slap was unnerving. Instead of lashing out in rage, as anyone would have expected, he remained eerily composed. His eyes never left the flight attendant, and there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a cold, calculated resolve that unnerved her to her core. The slap, meant to assert dominance, had instead triggered something much deeper. This man, despite his wealth and apparent arrogance, was far more dangerous than she had initially thought. He wasn't simply angry. He was plotting his next move. Minutes passed, and the air in the cabin grew heavier. The flight crew could feel it, the unspoken tension that now stretched between them and the billionaire. The feeling of control they had once felt was slipping away. The slap had not only been a physical act, it had disturbed the delicate balance of power in ways they couldn't comprehend. The billionaire's eyes were cold, calculating. It was as though he were studying the flight attendant and the pilot, not as people, but as pieces in a larger game, pieces to be moved, manipulated, and discarded at will. Every action they took from now on would be scrutinized and twisted. He would control this situation, and they would have no idea how they were falling into his trap. As the flight continued, the billionaire didn't speak to them directly again. He remained silent, but the impact of his silence was more profound than any words could have been. It was a tactic, one designed to keep them on edge. The flight attendant tried to focus on her duties, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept glancing over at the billionaire, who sat in his seat like a predator, calmly observing everything around him. At first, she brushed it off as paranoia. After all, he was just a rich man, arrogant and entitled, no more dangerous than the others she had dealt with in her career. But she was wrong. He wasn't like the others. His wealth was more than a tool for self-indulgence. It was a weapon. And he wielded it with terrifying precision. It wasn't long before the billionaire began to test them. His approach was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. He would ask for things that were not within the scope of what the flight crew could provide. A glass of wine that didn't exist on the menu, a request to fly to a different destination, a demand for special treatment that no one else would dare ask for. Each of these requests was followed by a smile that was cold and devoid of warmth. At first, the flight attendant tried to accommodate him. She explained the rules politely, trying to maintain professionalism. But every time she did, the billionaire's smile grew more insistent. He pushed harder, each time increasing the pressure. With every rejection, he became more condescending. It was as if he wanted to see how much he could break them, how far he could push them before they cracked. The pilot, witnessing the slow degradation of his crew's morale, stepped in to intervene. But his efforts were futile. The billionaire turned his attention to him next, testing his leadership. Every command the pilot issued was met with skepticism, as if to question his authority. At first, the pilot stood firm, trying to assert control. But the billionaire was no ordinary man, and his wealth and status created an aura of invulnerability that the pilot couldn't ignore. He knew he had to maintain his composure, but even he couldn't deny the growing sense of helplessness. The game had shifted. The billionaire wasn't just manipulating them in the moment. He was slowly unraveling their confidence, pushing them into a corner where every word, every action, seemed like it could be the wrong one. The emotional toll was becoming apparent. The flight crew had once been a well-oiled machine, but now they were being pulled apart, thread by thread. Days passed, and the billionaire's tactics became more insidious. It was no longer about outright manipulation, it was about wearing them down. He planted seeds of doubt, small comments here and there, remarks that seemed innocent but were calculated to make them second-guess themselves. His questions about their competence, his insinuations about their ability to do their jobs, became a constant undercurrent. His presence was a constant pressure, a reminder that they were being watched and judged at every turn. The flight attendant found herself questioning every decision she made. She wondered if she had truly been good at her job or if she had just been going through the motions. She started doubting her ability to handle the situation, her mind clouded with the seeds of insecurity that the billionaire had planted. Every time she looked at him, she saw the smirk on his face, the satisfaction he took in her discomfort. She knew that the longer this went on, the more she would break. But she wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. The pilot, too, felt his resolve cracking. The confidence that had once come with his position seemed to be slipping away. The billionaire had found his weak spots, his doubts about his leadership, his fear of being judged by others, and had expertly used them against him. The pilot found himself questioning whether he was even capable of maintaining control of the flight anymore. His mind wandered to his own failures, to every mistake he had made in his career, and the billionaire seemed to know just which buttons to push. In the midst of all this, the billionaire remained calm, almost serene. He didn't need to raise his voice or escalate the conflict. His power lay in his ability to manipulate the flight crew's emotions, to turn them against themselves. Every time they tried to push back, he backed off just enough to make them doubt whether they were overreacting. The result was a creeping sense of powerlessness that threatened to consume them both. By now, the flight crew was on edge. Their nerves were frayed, their patience worn thin. Every moment they spent on this flight felt like a battle. And all the while, the billionaire watched, his eyes never leaving them, his mind working behind that cold, calculating smile. The psychological war he had started was far from over, and if anything, it was just beginning to escalate. The game was no longer subtle. The billionaire's manipulation had reached a boiling point. The psychological warfare between him and the flight crew had become intense, and they were no longer operating with the same clarity and efficiency they once did. What started as a battle for control had evolved into a slow, insidious erosion of the flight crew's confidence. The flight attendant, once composed and confident, now found herself second-guessing every decision. The billionaire's subtle jabs at her competence had taken their toll. She had started to believe his words, even when she knew they were baseless. He had turned every minor mistake she made into a grand failure, making her feel unworthy of her job. Every time she passed by his seat, she could feel his eyes on her, cold, calculating, watching for any weakness. She began to doubt herself, questioning whether she was cut out for the job. What used to be routine now felt like a constant test. She couldn't even speak without feeling that the billionaire was waiting for her to make another mistake. His words were never loud or forceful. They were delivered with a quiet, insidious calm that ate away at her resolve. "You didn't get that right, did you?" he would say, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Is that the best you can do?" The pilot wasn't immune to the billionaire's influence either. Every decision he made seemed to be met with skepticism. The billionaire, despite being just a passenger, had found a way to undermine his authority. The pilot was beginning to doubt his ability to lead the flight. Each time the billionaire subtly questioned his judgment, he felt a pang of insecurity. "Are you sure that's the best course of action?" the billionaire would ask, his tone polite but filled with a quiet challenge. "I've flown with much better pilots than you." The captain's thoughts became more scattered, his confidence shaken. He was once a man who commanded respect, but now he was beginning to feel small in the presence of the billionaire. Each time he felt himself slipping, he would try to recover, but the damage had already been done. His leadership, once firm and unwavering, was slowly being replaced by doubt. He began to wonder if he had ever truly been in control at all. The billionaire's psychological war was effective because it was not about grand gestures or force. It was about the subtle erosion of self-esteem, the constant questioning of the crew's abilities, and the slow manipulation of their emotions. He didn't need to raise his voice or make physical threats. Instead, he chipped away at their mental and emotional strength, isolating them, making them feel as though they were the ones who were losing control. With each passing hour, the flight attendant and pilot became more and more aware of the tension building between them and the billionaire. They began to feel the weight of his gaze, the pressure of his presence. They knew that something had shifted, but neither one of them could pinpoint exactly when it had happened. They had been drawn into his game, and now they were struggling to stay afloat. The billionaire had become the puppet master, pulling their strings without them even realizing it. It wasn't enough to make them angry. No, he didn't want them angry. He wanted them confused, vulnerable, and self-doubting. He wanted to make them question their worth, their abilities, and their place in the world. And it was working. Each time the flight attendant made a mistake, even a small one, the billionaire was there to remind her of it, to twist the knife just a little bit deeper. The pilot, on the other hand, was losing his grip on the controls. The subtle undermining of his authority was wearing him down. He began to question every decision he made, wondering if he was really the right person to be in charge. The confidence that once came naturally to him was now a distant memory, replaced by the ever-present fear that he was failing, that he wasn't good enough to lead. It was a slow process, but the impact was undeniable. The billionaire's psychological games had turned the flight crew against themselves. They were no longer a united front. They had been fractured, and the cracks were beginning to show. Each time they interacted with him, they found themselves slipping further into the chaos he had created. Their actions were becoming more erratic, more hesitant. They were no longer operating with the precision they once had. Despite all of this, the billionaire remained calm. His smile never wavered, his posture never faltered. He was a master at this game, and he knew it. He wasn't just playing with their minds, he was playing with their emotions, their sense of self-worth. He could see the cracks forming, and he was only pushing them deeper, silently watching as the flight crew sank further into the psychological hole he had dug for them. It wasn't just about control. It was about breaking them down to the point where they no longer had the strength to resist. The billionaire didn't care about the slap anymore. That was just the catalyst. What mattered was the quiet destruction that followed. He knew that by the time the flight was over, he would have not only won but shattered them completely. As the hours passed, the billionaire's grip tightened. The flight crew, despite their best efforts, were starting to lose their hold on reality. They had become pawns in a game they didn't fully understand, and with every passing minute, they grew more and more isolated from each other, from themselves. The emotional toll of the billionaire's manipulation was starting to show. The flight attendant had become a shell of her former self, doubt and insecurity clouding her every thought. The pilot, once resolute and confident, now found himself questioning his every move. The game was far from over, but it was clear that the billionaire was winning. His psychological tactics were working, and the flight crew was succumbing to the pressure he had applied. Every action, every word from him was designed to keep them off balance, to make them question their place in the world. And with each passing hour, it seemed more and more likely that they would never escape the web he had so carefully woven around them. The tension had reached a critical point. The once strong unity of the flight crew was now in tatters. The billionaire's quiet but relentless psychological warfare had torn through their resolve, leaving only fragments of the professionalism and confidence they had once carried so proudly. The game had escalated, and they were now fully aware that they had been drawn into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The flight attendant felt like she was losing herself. Every interaction with the billionaire left her more uncertain, more drained. His words were like poison, seeping into her thoughts, making her question her every move. She would replay every exchange in her mind, wondering if she had done something wrong, if she had somehow failed. She had always prided herself on being calm and capable under pressure, but now that pressure felt unbearable. Every time she thought she was handling the situation, the billionaire would find another way to make her doubt herself. It wasn't even the things he said directly. It was the way he said them, the way he implied weakness without overtly attacking. It was insidious, And it was working. The pilot, too, was on the edge. His once confident decisions had now become second-guessed and hesitant. The billionaire's subtle undermining had shaken his confidence to the core. What used to be instinct, those quick, decisive judgments that had always come so naturally, now felt like a heavy burden. Every command he gave seemed to be met with quiet resistance in his own mind. He found himself constantly asking, "Am I making the right call?" The doubts had crept in slowly but now consumed his every thought. The power dynamic that had once been so clearly defined, pilot and crew in charge, the billionaire as a mere passenger, had shifted. It was no longer just a flight. It was a battleground, and the billionaire had turned the tables. He had managed to create a perfect storm of self-doubt, pushing the flight crew to the brink. He was using their own insecurities as weapons against them, and they were powerless to stop it. What was worse was the fact that the flight crew was now isolated. The billionaire had made sure of that. There was no solidarity between them anymore. The flight attendant, once a pillar of support for the crew, was now too consumed by her own doubts to be of help. The pilot, once the steady hand at the helm, was now just as uncertain and shaken as she was. They couldn't turn to each other for reassurance. They were too far gone. It was as if they were both trapped in their own personal hells, unable to escape the mental trap the billionaire had set. In the midst of it all, the billionaire remained eerily calm, almost detached. He had broken them down, but it wasn't enough yet. The true victory for him wouldn't come from seeing them snap. It would come from seeing them crumble without even realizing they were doing it. He wasn't interested in the dramatic outbursts of anger. What he wanted was subtle. What he wanted was control over their minds, the kind of control that made them question their very sense of self. That was where the real power lay. Every small victory he won over the crew, every second of hesitation from the flight attendant, every doubtful glance from the pilot, was like a brick in the wall he was building around them. The walls of their confidence were slowly closing in, and neither one of them knew how to escape. The crew had become prisoners of their own minds, their self-worth eroding as the billionaire's quiet manipulations continued to chip away at them. The flight attendant, who had once been so sure of her place in the world, was now struggling to find her footing. The pilot, who had always been the rock, was now a man on the edge. The small mistakes they made, the insignificant failures, were amplified in their minds, turned into monumental errors by the billionaire's constant insinuations. They were both trapped in a downward spiral, and the more they fought it, the deeper they sank. But still, there was no outward display of aggression. No screaming, no physical altercations. The billionaire didn't need that. He didn't need them to lash out, he needed them to fall apart quietly, in a way that no one would notice until it was too late. The flight continued, hour after hour, each minute dragging them further into the abyss of their own minds. And yet, despite the chaos inside them, the flight crew had no idea what was coming next. They didn't know that the billionaire, despite his calm demeanor, was preparing for his final strike. He had watched them long enough to see the cracks form. He knew that the moment of their collapse was approaching. But it wasn't the collapse itself that interested him, it was what came afterward. He would have them in the palm of his hand, but it would be the final moments, the last act of manipulation, that would seal his victory. For now, the billionaire remained in control, a silent observer, watching as the flight crews slowly destroyed themselves. His calmness, his detachment, was a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the flight attendant and the pilot. They were broken, not by a single event, but by the accumulation of small, deliberate assaults on their minds. And yet they still didn't know how to fight back. As the flight neared its end, the feeling of inevitability hung in the air. The crew had been pushed to their breaking points, and the billionaire had maneuvered them into positions where they couldn't help but question everything they had known. The mental toll was too great, and they were losing the battle. The game was over. As the final stages of the flight approached, the tension in the cabin had shifted. The flight crew, battered and bruised by the billionaire's calculated psychological warfare, had finally reached a turning point. They had been broken down, but not beyond repair. Something had clicked within them, A realization that the billionaire had pushed them this far because he thought they would never fight back. And now, as the end of the journey loomed, they were ready to take back control. The flight attendant, once crippled by self-doubt, had found a new sense of clarity. The seeds of uncertainty that the billionaire had planted in her mind began to wither. She recognized now that he had only succeeded because she had allowed herself to be manipulated. No more. The slap had been the beginning of a downward spiral, but it would not define her. She was not the person the billionaire had made her feel like. She was stronger than that. She had the power to choose how she responded, and it was time to stop letting him dictate her thoughts. Every word the billionaire had spoken to her, every subtle jab at her competence, now seemed small, insignificant. She could see through his tactics. She could feel the hold he had on her loosening. Her mind no longer raced with doubt. She no longer questioned her worth or abilities. Instead, she focused on the work at hand. She regained the poise that had once come so naturally, moving through the cabin with confidence, her actions purposeful and deliberate. The pilot, too, had felt the shift. His mind had been clouded with insecurities, each decision weighed down by the fear that he was no longer capable. But as the flight neared its final descent, a calmness washed over him. The billionaire's constant questioning of his leadership had made him feel like an imposter, but now he saw the truth. The man in first class had been preying on his weaknesses, turning them into mountains of doubt. But the pilot had climbed those mountains, and now he could see that they were just hills. His decisions, once made with hesitation, were now solid and sure. His confidence was returning, not because the billionaire had stopped trying to break him, but because the pilot had stopped letting him. He was in charge of the flight, of the crew, of his own mind. The thoughts of failure, of being judged, began to fade. The doubt that had plagued him was replaced with the clarity of purpose that had been lost for so long. It wasn't about proving something to the billionaire. It was about proving something to himself. The moment of clarity for the flight attendant and pilot was not a grand gesture or a single defining event. It was the gradual, subtle shift in their mindset. They had been manipulated to the brink, but in doing so, they had discovered their own resilience. They had realized that the billionaire's power over them only existed as long as they allowed it to. They had the ability to break free, and now, they were doing just that. The billionaire, however, had not stopped watching them. He had been waiting for this exact moment, the moment when they would start to fight back. He had been so careful, so precise with his manipulation, that he hadn't anticipated this kind of resistance. His plan had been to break them, to destroy their confidence, and it had worked, until it didn't. Now, as he watched them regain their composure, he realized that they were no longer the pawns in his game. They had become players in their own right. The flight attendant and pilot, no longer isolated in their self-doubt, exchanged silent glances. They knew that the battle was far from over. They weren't fully in control yet, but they were no longer on the defensive. The power dynamic had shifted again, and it was now a contest of wills. The billionaire's calm facade began to crack, his cool demeanor slipping ever so slightly as the realization dawned on him. He had underestimated them. It was in the smallest moments that the true power of their transformation began to show. The flight attendant moved with purpose, her every action exuding confidence. She wasn't afraid of his judgment anymore. Every interaction with the billionaire, once a source of anxiety, now felt like an opportunity to demonstrate her strength. When he made another veiled insult, she didn't flinch. She responded with composure, not defensiveness, and it was clear to everyone watching, especially to him, that she was no longer under his control. The pilot, too, found his voice again. Where once he would have second-guessed his decisions, now he acted decisively. His leadership had returned, and the respect he had commanded before was slowly being reinstated. He wasn't concerned with the billionaire's opinion anymore. He had his crew to lead, and that was all that mattered. The flight was nearly over, but it was clear that this was the point where the billionaire's game would end. He had tried to break them, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and more resolute than ever. The billionaire, now faced with the crew's resilience, tried one last attempt at control. He made one final subtle comment, a slight edge to his tone, as if he could still provoke them into doubt. But it was too late. His words fell flat. The flight attendant didn't even acknowledge him. The pilot simply nodded, his mind already focused on the final steps of the flight. They had both seen through his tactics, and they no longer cared for his approval or his power. The remainder of the flight passed in relative silence. There was no confrontation, no explosion of anger. The billionaire had no choice but to watch as his carefully constructed web of manipulation unraveled. The crew had reclaimed their confidence, their leadership, and their dignity. What had once been a battle for control had turned into a battle for self-empowerment, and the crew had emerged victorious. As the flight landed, the crew knew that they had won, not because they had outsmarted the billionaire, but because they had taken back what he had tried to steal, their belief in themselves. The billionaire, for all his wealth and power, had failed to break them. The journey had ended, but the real transformation had only just begun. The flight attendant and pilot had found their strength, and that strength would remain long after the flight had touched down. As the flight touched down, the cabin filled with the low hum of the landing gear making contact with the runway, but inside the minds of the flight attendant and the pilot, there was no sense of relief. They had reached the final destination, but the real journey was only beginning. The billionaire's psychological tactics had left deep marks, but something had changed within them, something they hadn't expected. They had faced his manipulations head-on, and for the first time in days, they felt the weight of his control start to lift. In the cockpit, the pilot adjusted the controls with a calmness he hadn't felt for the duration of the flight. His hands, once trembling with uncertainty, were now steady. His thoughts were clear. He wasn't thinking about the billionaire's criticisms, nor was he questioning his every move anymore. He had let go of the fear that had clouded his judgment. The flight, which had once felt like a test, had become an affirmation of his ability, of his leadership. He was the pilot. He was the one in control. The billionaire's manipulation had been an illusion. His doubts had been his own creation, and now that he recognized that, the confidence that had always been buried within him surfaced once again. The flight attendant, too, was not the same person who had stepped on board hours before. She had always been competent, but this experience had brought something out in her that she hadn't known she was capable of: resilience. The billionaire's efforts to tear her down had given her a strength she hadn't anticipated. She had been pushed to her breaking point, but in doing so, she had learned something vital: her value was not defined by anyone's words, especially not his. She had allowed herself to fall victim to his game, but she had also found the courage to rise above it. Every action she took now was purposeful, every decision made with the conviction of someone who had reclaimed her sense of self. They walked through the terminal, side by side, the echoes of the billionaire's mental game still lingering in the back of their minds. The last moments of the flight had been tense, but not because of the billionaire. It was because they were beginning to process what had happened, to understand the depth of what they had overcome. It wasn't just about standing up to him. It was about standing up to themselves. The mental strain he had placed on them had been suffocating, but they had found a way to fight back, not with aggression, but with clarity, strength, and resilience. As they passed through security and into the final stretch of the airport, they saw a shift in the way they carried themselves. They didn't speak of it, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had been through something profound together, something that went beyond the professional environment of the plane. What had started as a moment of defiance, a slap to a powerful man who thought he could manipulate them, had evolved into a moment of self-realization. They had faced the darkest parts of themselves, and they had survived. The billionaire's actions, his control, his manipulation, they were all attempts to impose his power on others, to make them feel small so he could feel big. But in the end, it was clear who had the real power. Not him, but the flight crew. They were the ones who had endured, who had come out of it stronger, unbroken. He had failed in his mission to bring them down. His revenge had been hollow, a hollow victory that meant nothing because he had never understood the true source of power, self-confidence, resilience, and integrity. As they walked through the airport together, the weight of the experience slowly started to dissipate. They were no longer the people who had been shaken by the billionaire's words. They had transformed. The doubts that had plagued them were gone. They were ready for whatever came next. They had learned to trust themselves, to rely on their own strength. The billionaire's psychological war had tested their limits, but in the process, it had shown them just how much they were capable of enduring and overcoming. In that moment, the flight attendant and pilot shared a silent acknowledgement. They didn't need to say anything to understand what had happened. They had faced something that could have broken them, and they had emerged victorious. The billionaire had tried to strip them of their dignity, to reduce them to mere puppets in his game. But they had shown him that they were not his to control. The power was theirs, and always had been. The real revenge was not in getting back at him, but in finding themselves again, in realizing that they were stronger than they had ever known. As they prepared to leave the airport, the experiences of the flight remained with them, but no longer as a burden. They had learned, grown, and most importantly, they had reclaimed what was theirs. The billionaire had tried to break them, but he had only made them stronger. They had found their resilience, their power, and in the process, they had found each other's support. In the end, the flight had been a journey not just across the sky, but into the depths of their own strength. And that was the greatest victory of all. The final descent into the resolution of this long and mentally taxing journey had arrived. The flight crew was on solid ground now, but the internal transformation they had undergone was only beginning to take shape. They had faced the billionaire's psychological games and had emerged victorious, but the real work was about to start. The battle they fought wasn't against the billionaire's wealth, status, or power. It was against their own self-doubt, their own insecurities that he had carefully exploited. And now, having survived the psychological onslaught, they had to rebuild what had been shaken. The pilot's thoughts were clearer than ever. The power that the billionaire had once held over him was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of responsibility and clarity. He had been reduced to questioning every decision, every action he took. But now, as he stood firmly on the ground, he understood that leadership was not about having perfect decisions at all times. It was about rising after every fall, reclaiming authority over oneself, and learning to trust instinct above external judgment. He had been a leader before, and he would be one again. The experience had shaken his confidence, but it had also given him a deep well of resilience to draw from. There was no longer any question about his capabilities. Every moment of hesitation during the flight, every second of self-doubt, seemed irrelevant now. The journey was not about being perfect, it was about moving forward, even when the path seemed unclear. And now, he had regained that clarity. The billionaire's subtle manipulations had made him question his every action, but that chapter was over. He had learned the invaluable lesson of not letting anyone's perception, no matter how influential, define his worth or leadership. The pilot had faced the depths of his vulnerability, and he had come out the other side as a stronger, more grounded individual. For the flight attendant, the shift was even more profound. She had been the one who had endured the initial slap, the catalyst for this whole series of events. The slap had been the moment of outward defiance, but it had also opened a floodgate of insecurities that she had been hiding from for years. The billionaire's words had gnawed at her self-worth, but she had realized, in the quiet moments of introspection, that his words were only reflections of her own doubts. She had allowed him to break her because, in part, she had never fully believed in herself. But now, that was different. The strength she had thought was buried beneath her fears had emerged, more potent than anything she had imagined. Her true power lay not in her ability to serve others, but in her ability to serve herself, to value her worth regardless of how anyone else saw her. She had spent so long in the shadow of external expectations, constantly seeking approval from those around her, particularly from the billionaire. Now she knew that approval came from within. She had given too much power to someone who didn't deserve it. She had allowed his cruel words to shape her self-image, but no longer. The internal battle had been won, and she had regained her sense of self. The billionaire, for all his wealth and status, had underestimated the strength that lay within the flight crew. He thought that by playing on their insecurities, he could make them crumble. But in doing so, he had revealed his own weakness. He had no understanding of the true power of resilience. He had no comprehension of the depths that the human spirit could reach when pushed to its limits. While he focused on tearing them down, they had risen higher than he could have ever predicted. Now, standing on the other side of this conflict, the pilot and flight attendant shared an unspoken bond. They no longer saw themselves as victims. They had been tested by the billionaire's manipulation, but they had come out of it stronger, more determined, and with an unshakable sense of self-worth. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about proving to themselves that they were capable of overcoming any challenge, no matter how insidious or manipulative. As they walked away from the tarmac, the journey they had just completed felt both surreal and empowering. They had faced the billionaire's psychological games, had been pushed to their limits, and had found a new strength within themselves. But they also knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. The memories of what had happened would stay with them, but they were no longer scars. They were marks of survival, reminders of the battle they had fought and won. What they had gained through this experience could not be taken from them. They had learned to trust themselves, to find power in their vulnerability, and to reclaim what had once been stolen: self-confidence, leadership, and a sense of inner peace. The lessons they learned through this trial would serve them for the rest of their lives. They now understood that no external force, no matter how powerful, could take away their inner strength unless they allowed it. The billionaire's manipulation had been an attempt to break them, but in the end, he had succeeded only in forging a new sense of purpose within them. They had been transformed not by the conflict, but by their ability to rise above it. The battle for their minds, their confidence, and their dignity had been hard fought, but it was the internal victory that mattered most. And as they parted ways, there was no lingering resentment, no need for confrontation. The victory had been won silently, within themselves. They had conquered not the billionaire, but the doubts and fears that had kept them confined. And that was the most powerful transformation of all. They knew now that no matter what came next, they would face it as individuals who had reclaimed their own power. The billionaire's reign over their minds had ended, and the future was theirs to shape.